Hello, and welcome to this edition of Table Talk, a series of conversations with writers, academics, scholars, and activists who work on human-animal relations. We are the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I am Anu Pande, and my host is Susan Haris. Our guest tonight is Kári Driscoll from Utrecht University, and we are going to be talking to him about his article, Perpetrators, Animals, and Animality. Before we start, I would like to mention that this table talk is going to last for about an hour. So please feel free to join in with your questions and comments at any time. Please just unmute yourself, raise a hand, or type your questions in the chat box. A very warm welcome to you, Kári. We are delighted to have this opportunity to discuss your work with you. I would like to start by asking you to comment on the zero-sum logic. So a lot has been said and written about its fallacy. Michael Rothberg has shown, for example, in multidirectional memory, why it is untenable in the context of the Holocaust, and yet it persists in academic circles, including in debates pertaining to animals and animal studies, as you also discuss in your article. How would you explain the tenacity of this argument, which has repeatedly been demonstrated to actually be a non-argument?
Okay, that's a big question to begin with. First of all, thank you for having me, and it's very nice to talk to you, to have this opportunity to talk about this about my work with you. I think with the zero-sum logic is the kind of the logic of scarcity, which is fostered, I think, by the disciplinary structures of the university, and so to a large extent, you're sort of trained to think in to think in terms of zero-sum logics. That if you looking at thinking of focusing your attention or devoting your intellectual or financial resources over here mean that you automatically have to withdraw them from somewhere else, and so it's a constant. I wouldn't say that it's a non-argument. I think that it's a very powerful argument, but it's one that powerful in the sense that it's pervasive. I don't think that it's a good argument, but I think it's effective in a kind of divide and conquer sense of getting everybody to scramble for attention and resources and so on, and then if you think, oh wait, no, here are these other people, animal studies is not a real field, we need to shut this down because they're coming to muddy the waters and disrupt our position, then we need to. There's a lot of kind of boundary policing that results from that, and so part of the motivation for the piece, which is a chapter from the handbook of perpetrator studies, which is edited by a colleague of mine here at Utrecht. Perpetrator studies is not my field, so the idea behind the contribution, or there's a section in the handbook in which she invited people who don't work on perpetration or even in memory studies or genocide studies or whatever, to think about how the questions at the heart of those fields would be relevant to their fields, in my case, animal studies, and vice versa. And so it's written in this kind of rereading it for this. It's I think it's a little bit of a polemic, also because I'm trying to. My intended audience is people who are probably going to be skeptical of, what do you mean animal perpetrators? How could this possibly, isn't this the most ridiculous thing you could imagine? We have enough to do worrying about human perpetrators and human victims and so on. Don't let's get distracted with these non-humans. And so the aim of the article is to try to suggest that maybe animals and animality are central to the questions of genocide and perpetration. That was a kind of a rambling answer. I'm not sure that.
No, we like rambling answers. Thank you.
Okay, good. Well, that's all right. I'm very relieved.
Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, I was at this conference, a workshop a few weeks back, which was on history, memory, and forgetting. And the concept note had the word Anthropocene in it. And it seemed like they were going to engage with non-human histories or something of that sort. But, at the workshop, nobody really talked about it at all. So my initial, I thought initially, so when you said that about disciplinary expectations and staying in particular lanes, I did experience that. But I also felt that some of the historians who were there, they were also representing oppressed groups or speaking about certain oppressions, like about caste system. And, as representatives of that particular oppression, I did feel that, speaking about the animal would take away from the force of, the bare existence of the human. So in that way, it did seem like a zero-sum logic, because as it is, they are underrepresented. As it is, nobody speaks about them. And so to speak about the animal in any way would really, sidetrack the main issue. So I'm just curious about what you think.
Well, I mean, I think this is a very important thing to consider, and it's something that animal studies and sort of more than human studies, or whatever we want to call it now, needs to posthumanism needs to be very aware of. I know that, like, so Alexander Wehelier gives Carrie Wolf a hard time for suggesting that that sort of Black and post-colonial thinking has not paid enough attention to the question of the animal and so on, and Zakiya Jackson sort of suggests that maybe white intellectuals at major American and European universities are quite happy to sort of leave behind the category of the human, but there's a lot of people in the world who haven't, for whom humanity is not, or the recognition of being human is not self-evident. And so there is a danger especially within. I mean, coming back to the zero-sum logic, I think it's powerful because that is, it is not possible to pay attention to everything at the same time, and it is a scramble for resources and so on within the sort of capitalist university setting, or not a social setting that we find ourselves in. And so, what am I trying to say? I think that there is sometimes on the part of activist groups and animal studies scholars more generally a sort of, there's a danger of being, well, why are you talking about this? We should be talking about animals, or why are you worrying about this? What about these dogs or these cows, or what about non-human suffering, which then can be very counterproductive in terms of, well, we have real problems here that we need to be dealing with, and then maybe we'll deal with those we'll worry about this other thing some other time, or somebody else can worry about that. And so I think the only way to get beyond this, and it's a very delicate and very, very complicated operation is to think about, or to reflect on, how the category of the human and the category of the animal are not stable or pre-given or whatever, and that in fact the sort of the struggles that you're talking about are bound up with with who is recognized as having the kind of life that is worthy of attention, and that this is and that the question of the animal is not is precisely to question the self-evidence with which we think about, what is an animal and what is a human. Does that I feel like I haven't answered that question exactly, but do you see what I mean? That I mean, I don't have necessarily a strategy in mind here, but and the audience for this chapter that I wrote was sort of more these sort of, the Schulte people with their hoax article and so on. So it was really, it also grew out of a kind of a frustration with a self-satisfied rendering, finding any kind of post-humanist theory or approach self-evidently ridiculous, because we all know, who cares about animals and whatever, right? And this was also, anyway, we can talk about that later, but this was also, sorry?
No, I just have a follow-up question to that,
yeah.
Which is, in this essay as well, you talk about genocide, and this is something that I've been thinking about lately. When we're thinking about human suffering and non-human suffering, even if the category of human and non-human should be blurred, I feel like there is still a distinction between human and non-human suffering. So would you, and there is some, I feel like there's some kind of utilitarian logic that's always working, which suffering is more, something is the non-human suffering more, what is computable, and how can we compare that? So in that case, what would your approach to, I know that you cite Derrida and, talk about how that's common, but what would your approach to non-human suffering be? Would that, again, would you understand it as something that all of us share, as a shared finitude, as Derrida maybe would say, or would you say, as an animal studies scholar, that non-human suffering is something distinct?
Distinct from what?
From human suffering.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would say, like, as Judith Butler says in Frames of War, it's when humans suffer, it's as animals that they suffer, right? I mean, when we, like, I don't think that it's, or I'm not sure how it would. I don't know if I would, I'm not sure I want to talk about shared finitude and that sort of thing, but I'm not sure what exactly you mean by drawing a sharp distinction between non-human and human suffering. Could you, I mean, where do you? I suppose I'm asking, are you talking about this on an ontological level or on a discursive level? Because on an ontological level, I don't know how you would draw that distinction or what the purpose of that would be.
I just feel that while I also subscribe to the idea that the category of human and non-human, that is a distinction that we make, and that division should be blurred. I feel that as an animal studies scholar, or as a person who's trying to talk about the question of the animal, I do draw in my work a distinction between human suffering and animal suffering, because I can perceive what animal suffering is. You see what I mean? So in that case, I'm not so certain that personally I'm drawing, I'm not sure if that kind of suffering is something that can be blurred.
Why not?
Because in the case of suffering, I feel that animals are a separate, unique category.
Okay, I'm not sure. Well, let me maybe backtrack a little bit. So when talking about the point that I was trying to make about the category of genocide is as it circulates in the fields of genocide studies, memory studies, perpetrator studies, tends to the definition of genocide as it typically circulates implies very strongly that this is a human community. But if for a variety of reasons, but in any case of genocide, what is at stake is very strongly the category of the human and the recognizability of various victims as being human or not, and thereby the dog has entered the picture here, being that their suffering be recognized as being human suffering and therefore of ethical significance and that sort of thing, right? And this is, of course, it is important to recognize that, but in many or what happens in the case of genocidal violence is that very often it's not just human beings that are, I don't know why, human beings that are affected. These processes have more than human consequences, and so if you want to study these phenomena and understand how they work, then it is counterproductive, I think, to operate with a reified and uncritical conception of the human-animal binary or nature-culture binary, right? If, when it comes to the question of what is it that a genocide kills, that this something more that is killed by in the case of a genocide is not reducible either to the category of the human or the category of the animal, but encompasses maybe the relationality between different forms of life and different life forms.
Susan, do you want to follow up on that, or shall we go ahead?
I'm going to think about what you said.
Yeah. I was also wondering why you were, or what you meant by, this is addressed to you, Susan, what you meant by there being a difference in human and non-human suffering. So maybe we can come back to that later, just so you can explain your position on this. But something that occurred to me while we were having this conversation with Kári right now was what you wrote about Kári in your chapter about the idea of the human-animal border as an inner border, which I think is of central importance in your article, as well as for perpetrator studies as well. And it reminded me also of the table talk we had with one of our recent guests, Ozan Zibek, who stressed on the fact that military conflict and biopolitical violence also affected non-human animals in Turkey, for example. Just to bring all this into perspective and for the benefit of those of our attendees who might perhaps not be familiar with your article, could you elaborate on what you mean by this human-animal border as an inner border? Because I think it brings in also the aspect of animalization, which you discuss in this piece.
Sure. So so maybe I should start by saying that there was this, and this is how I start the piece. There was in 2015 there was this scandal that rocked the world of animal studies, especially in Germany, with the publication of this fake article about the inner German border, sort of about the use of guard dogs along the Berlin Wall in the kind of in the death strip. And the title of this article is Der Deutsche Schäferhund, which is a kind of a joke. Is actually pretty funny. It's the cleverest part of the article, right? So the border between West Germany and East Germany is known in German as the Deutsch-Deutsche Grenze, right? So the German border, and the German Shepherd is the Deutsche Schäferhund, and this article then calls it the Deutsch-Deutsche Schäferhund, so the German Shepherd, this article sort of alleges that there is this that the authors claimed that they had found a kind of archival proof of a direct lineage, like a family lineage of the guard dogs used in the Nazi concentration camps, and then later in the GDR to the ones being used in by the German military today to deal with the migrant crisis, which was so-called, which was reaching its climax in 2015. And I find this article really irritating, but also quite interesting in the way that it actually puts its finger on something very interesting. And then, because the authors think that animal studies is ridiculous and everybody will understand this, they totally miss the point that they're making themselves, which is that this border and the way that the death strip is a place of contestation where the status of political subjecthood is being established, and that animals are used to control the flow of human populations and so on, who are then animalized and whatever. That this is a biopolitical apparatus, which literalizes Agamben's idea of the anthropological machine as this mechanism for producing the recognition of the human. And one of the reasons that the authors of this article think that it's so self-evidently ridiculous that anybody interested in, politics or sociology or whatever would think about animals, because who cares about animals? They take it for granted that there is this strict nature-culture separation. And so they're trying desperately to police the boundaries between disciplines and between nature and culture, right? And they say that animal studies, it's fine, we can talk about animals or whatever, but if so, we have to do it in the proper language of zoology and biology and whatever. Animals have no business in sociology or political theory, because everybody knows that sociology and political theory is only about humans. And so this entire article is kind of trying to lampoon animal studies, but actually ends up making despite itself, an argument for why sociology needs to take animals seriously, because they end up undermining their own argument, it seems to me. And one of the allegations, and I think that this is a common allegation, and this maybe goes back to the question of the zero-sum logic that you were talking about at the beginning, is that so they say that I find it kind of interesting. Their argument can basically be summarized as society must be defended, which is Foucault's formula for biopolitics anyway, right? And they say we need to have a concept of society as separate from nature, and they're sort of willing to die on this hill, as it were. but they assume that what animal studies wants to do is eliminate the border and say there is no difference between humans and animals. And this would be terrible, because then everything, how can we tell one thing from another? We'll have dogs and cats living together and pandemonium and so on. And so we need these rigid distinctions in order to hold on to our concepts and in order to be able to be politically effective. Because if everything is everything, then how can we know what is what? And so but this is in fact not, at least as far as I'm concerned, what animal studies is trying to do. It's certainly not what I'm trying to do. The point is not to say that there is no difference between humans and animals. The point is to say that there is not one difference between the human and the animal, and that you cannot actually draw the boundary where you would like to draw the boundary. And part of the problem, or one of the main reasons that that's not possible is that humans are also animals. And that some humans are recognized as being more human at certain points in history and in certain places than others, and that this being recognizability as a human subject is always open to contestation, depending on where you live and what you look like and what you believe in and what your socioeconomic status is and so on. And so this sort of metaphor of the boundary policing and of the inner border, I think goes to the heart of what is at stake in the question of the animal, as it were, because the question of the animal is not something that only relates to non-human animals, as if we automatically know what they are, and excludes the human, because humans are also animals. Yeah, and so that's sort of how I what's the word? I seize onto this figure of the inner border in their article and use it against them. Well, that's kind of what I was trying to do.
Thank you. That's very helpful, because it also helps us understand processes of othering, for example, tying it in with processes of animalizing of humans, but also of animals, as you bring up also in your chapter. The other thing that you just mentioned about how there is this kind of misconception of what animal studies are all about or what they are trying to do. And certain people believe that they are all about abolishing or negating the difference between humans and non-human animals. And that just made me think about a PhD thesis, which recently came to me for external assessment. And that was the problem. It was a literary animal studies work, but the Ausgangspunkt, the point of departure.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Was exactly that the scholar was trying to prove at each point that there is no difference between humans and animals. And I found that quite telling, actually. I mean, problematic also, but also very telling about how people within the field also sometimes have this sort of notion that it's their job, it's their task to sort of claim that we are all the same, that there's no difference, as if that were the project of animal studies. Coming on to my next question, while looking at animals as perpetrators in your article, you show how certain non-human species have historically been conscripted, so to speak, in colonial and biopolitical projects because of particular characteristics that they have. Even though they are deployed by humans, they become then agents of such projects. And I have been wondering since reading your chapter whether we can consider the cases of what we call cow vigilantism in India in this light. And in case some of us are not familiar with the term or what I mean by it, India has had a Hindu nationalistic government. And in the last 8 years or so, maybe a little longer, there have been several incidents of Muslim or Dalit men being lynched by a Hindu mob on suspicion of slaughtering cows, which are considered holy among caste Hindus, or transporting cow meat. What are your thoughts on this? Can we see such incidents also in this light, or in line with this argument, with this line of thought?
Well, I wouldn't want to say that the cows are responsible for this in such an instance. No, and I think that it's a very difficult question. But my Ausgangspunkt for the chapter was, if let's set up a kind of a grammar square when it comes to how we can think about the question of the perpetrator and the question of the animal together, right? And from my perspective, coming back to what you were saying, animal studies only make sense as a field if it's one that is constantly questioning the logic of the animal, right? I mean, as soon as we take it for granted that we know, well, this is an animal, that's not an animal, so we can focus on this, and this other thing is irrelevant, then it ceases to be interesting, right? So I think that just like gender studies or whatever, animal studies is a field in which the term that gives it its name has to be an essentially contested concept. It has to be something that is constantly being interrogated. Same with perpetrator studies, in my view, that it's part of the point of having something called perpetrator studies would be to ask what do we even mean when we say perpetrator. And so so when I started thinking about how I would contribute to this handbook of perpetrator studies, how I would bring perpetrator studies into conversation with animal studies, I thought, okay, so you can think about sort of animality or animalization as a metaphorical procedure. And so you can think about, so if we think about we can think about always the sort of the material and the semiotic, or the physical and the metaphorical, or the literal and the figurative animal in relation to both the categories of the perpetrator and the victim, and in the context of Holocaust memory and so on. This and Coetzee talks about this very much in the Lives of Animals. There's this idea that the perpetrators are beasts and whatever, and they brutalize themselves through these acts of perpetration, and the victims themselves are figuratively go like lambs to the slaughter and so on. And so it's fairly clear how you can think about it metaphorically, but can we think about it literally using with regard to the actual animals? And when it comes to animals as victims of genocidal violence, so in the case of the buffalo genocide, so called, in North America, it's very clear that or in the sixth extinction, it's very clear that the non-human world has also been the victim of mass political violence, even though that wouldn't ordinarily count as genocide or whatever, because that tends to be limited to humans. And then there's the bottom right-hand corner, as I'm imagining it, of this square, which is, can we think of animals as perpetrators of genocide? And this is a really complicated question. We can, right, and there are some examples. There's the Gombe massacre that Jane Goodall documents, where one group of chimpanzees went and systematically slaughtered another group, and that this seems to be sort of intra-chimpanzee genocide, if we can think about it in those terms. And in other cases, you know, but that's a very extreme example. And so what I try to do toward the end is think about, well, maybe in order for this question even to make sense, and in order for the sort of the contestation of the category of the animal and the contestation of the category of the perpetrator to sort of work together, maybe we should think about what constitutes perpetration, what kind of what does it mean to what kinds of involvement in genocidal violence are there, and when it comes to thinking about human responsibility and agency in these situations, it's commonplace to assume that any individual within a sort of totalitarian genocidal system will only have a certain amount of room to maneuver to either participate or resist this kind of violence. But there's no inherent reason to assume that this way of thinking about agency as being shared and as being sort of delimited and situational would be limited only to human beings. And so I'm not sure how I would think about your the example that you gave there, because it seems to me that that's slightly, well, that has less to do with the agency of the cows themselves. They don't seem to have very much agency in that situation, but that violence only makes sense within the context of a certain sort of politicization of both groups of humans and of groups of animals, right? And this is a conflict, or at least it pretends to be a conflict. I don't know, you know more about it than I do, but it's a conflict where a different status is being ascribed to certain non-humans, resulting in intra-human conflicts that don't make sense if you disregard the category of the animal.
Yeah,
I
I
suppose.
think of this example because the cow is considered holy because it's considered the mother because of it being a milch animal, and those who are accused of slaughtering cows or transporting their meat are in that moment of lynching, sort of being dehumanized, whereas the cow, the way I see it, is being humanized. So in that way, this is actually something that has been instrumentalized a lot in the last few years. And yeah, with obviously a sort of biopolitical aim behind it. So of course, the mob isn't just a mob, as is
No.
already, yeah.
And I believe I'm correct in saying that India is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, producer of beef and exporter of beef in the world. And so the fact that this is right, so everything is kind of displaced then into these situations, whereas actually it's going on, and it's actually the country benefit or sort of profits from this while officially condemning it and even then perpetrating violence in the name of it.
Absolutely, and it's also tied very deeply, very closely to questions of identity, because to handle meat, and in case of the leather industry also, who are involved in it, have historically been either Muslim or from the lower castes.
Yeah.
So in that sense, being doubly condemned in a way because of their caste identity or religious identity, and then this added thing that that comes into play. We have a question from Jan Martin Poe in the chat. Kári, can you see that? Should I read it aloud?
Maybe read it aloud, it'll be better for the recording.
Absolutely. Is there a way to make sense of animal-oriented ontology outside the anthropocentric perspective? If there is, to which extent should the anthropocentric view be observed in the entanglement of these two interesting fields?
Is Jan Marvin here? Could I ask you to elaborate on this, especially the first part of the question? I'm not sure I'm able to parse it here. It's just like we make sense of animals from the viewpoint of humans. Yes, what other viewpoint would you? Sure. Sorry, I should read this out. And then it's like we merely speak on behalf of them in making sense of their perspective. Well, this is, I mean, this is unavoidable, I think, to a certain extent, right? It's very difficult to, well, I don't know, but it's very difficult to ask a group of, or part of the problem that we face is that non-human animals lack political representation because they are not able to participate in the established political and juridical systems that we have in place. But, and I'm not sure how you would overcome this, but I'm also not sure what you mean by, or I'm not sure. Let me put it differently. I'm less interested in ontology, so I'm a kind of, I'm really a literary studies scholar. We were talking about this here before the recording started, so this whole thing is kind of a bit of a departure for me. But fundamentally, what I'm interested in is discourses and thinking about. So I'm not particularly interested in drawing. You say, where should we draw the line? Do you mean draw the line between humans and animals? Because I think what I'm trying to get at in the piece, and what I think we should emphasize is that it's very difficult to know where to draw the line, and that in fact the category of human and the category of the animal, or the category of culture and nature and so on, are never as clear cut, and that in fact we all live in communities of humans and non-humans already, right? And I feel like I'm not getting to the essence of your question here, but I think that it's, how shall I put this differently, right? So you say, to what extent should the anthropocentric view be observed? I'm still not quite sure how to answer this question. I think, right, you always speak from somewhere, and but the question is whether the fact that I'm a human being means that my perspective is necessarily anthropocentric. I think that there's a difference between, or maybe what there needs to be we need to draw a distinction between anthropocentrism and human supremacy, let's say, and that I think that it's possible to be situated within a more than human field and think about questions of history and culture and society as more than human entanglements without falling into the trap of assuming that I know what it is like to be a cow or a dog or a bat or whatever, to use the right, and that I can simply speak on their behalf, and that I can embody this. Right, but right, so you can still speak as a human without assuming that only you can still acknowledge that yours is a limited perspective without assuming that either you can simply overcome that, or that the human perspective is the only one that matters or should be taken into consideration. Apparently, I'm answering this question, so that's great. I'm glad to hear it.
Thank you. I have another question, and then we'll go quickly over to Susan's question because she's waiting as well. So in our series of table talks, we've often come to what's agency, and we've had several discussions about it, and whether agency should include intentionality. This has been, like this recurring theme, obviously. And then someone else outside the Indian Animal Studies Collective, whom I recently discussed agency with, said that it must also include culpability.
Culpability?
Yes.
Yeah.
Your position is clearly against intentionality. And I wonder if you could take us through why you are against intentionality being understood as a part of agency.
Sure, that's a small question. So, well, there's a lot of, well, in the let me go back. So Philip Howell in the book of in another handbook of, I can't remember, it's called Historical Animal Studies or something to that effect, sort of lays out three different ways of thinking about agency, which I find, and this I find this is a very helpful differentiation, because it's, sometimes people, right? So one way to think about agency is that it has to be intentional and rational, and that you can only have, right, and otherwise it's, I don't know what you call it, right, but the kind of the typical liberal humanist way of thinking about it is that we are all rational agents, and we decide that I'm going to do this thing, and then I do it, and it has an effect in the world, and therefore I have agency. Whereas other things do, other processes have effects in the world, but they're not trying to bring those about, and so therefore it doesn't make sense to think about this in terms of agency. And if that's what you mean by agency, then sure, right? Then we can still talk about, how certain non-human animals, crows and whatever, clearly carry out deliberate actions, and so then we can talk about agency in those terms. But there are the three categories of agency that get beyond this sort of safety mechanism of presupposing a rational, intentional, autonomous subject are ascribed. I'm going to forget what they all are now, but I think ascribed agency, which is that it's less important to think about whether animals or anybody on some kind of fundamental ontological level really has agency, as if we could determine that, but rather within certain communities and societies, what kinds of entities have agency attributed to them, right? And so you may live in a society where, or in an episteme where non-human animals or plants or the weather or whatever are ascribed a certain kind of agency, and then that is something that you can study and take seriously from an anthropological or a sociological perspective, without having to define what you mean by agency, right? So it's less, do they really have this, or versus in the communities in which this is taking place, how do we think about what is happening here, and who has an influence on the way things go. And then there's the Agonistic Agency, which is Fatima Amir's concept, which is, there are all of these assumptions that, animals don't have agency. But if that were the case, then we wouldn't need all of these infrastructures to prevent animals from going places and doing things and whatever, right? And so there's all of these fences and barbed wire and whatever. All of this stuff is set up in order to make sure that that animals do what we want them to do, and if that is necessary, ipso facto, animals must have some kind of agency. Otherwise, we wouldn't need to curtail it. And then the third one is assembled, is that right? Agency, where agency is not the property of one entity, but rather is something that emerges through interactions between actors or agents. And this is one that is very popular in sort of new materialist conceptions. And one that gets us away from this kind of, I don't know, Kantian insistence that everybody is a rational individual autonomous subject.
Yeah, and also from the subject-object duality, where the agency rests on one side, and then if you think more in Latour's terms of an assemblage, then agency is right, and depends on where, when.
Absolutely, and right, and there are various problems or various issues that need to be kept in mind with this, which is that, right, so Andreas Malm writes endlessly about against this idea, attributing agency to atoms and to weather patterns and whatever, because if everything is entangled and humans actually are just parts of this greater system, then we can all sit back and relax and say we actually can't do anything about climate change and that sort of thing. Lovelock with his Gaia hypothesis was, directly funded by Shell and whatever, because the big oil companies are, of course, very interested in hearing about how the Earth is a self-regulating system, and that nothing we do will really have a huge impact and that sort of thing. But right, and so it has to. But I like to believe that it's possible to think about agency as something that is shared among human and non-human actors in various situations, and still think that something like political action is possible. And that's the kind of line that I'm trying to walk here, and that in fact this sort of rigid denial of saying no, it can only be humans, and we have to know ahead of time, who or what is a human and whatever, in order to be able to talk about all of these sorts of things, can act also as a kind of as a smokescreen or as an alibi for not actually dealing with what is really at stake in these situations, like with these dog runs along the German border, or at an anti-apartheid demonstration, or in Abu Ghraib, or whatever, where there are entanglements of humans and non-humans, and some of those humans are not being recognized as human, and so on. And some of those humans have a lot more agency in that situation than others do, and some of the animals have more agency than the humans, and so on, right? And so, to what extent is it meaningful to think about agency only in terms of intentionality, when actually it's in these sort of constellations who or what has agency, and to what extent is much more complex.
Thank you. Susan, go ahead.
My question's also about agency. I was thinking about, there's been a rise of rabies-related deaths in Kerala, and the Kerala government has asked for permission from the Supreme Court for these street dogs to be culled. So in a way, the discourse around rabies is of ascribing agency to these dogs, and that because these rabid dogs, and every dog is potentially a rabid dog, they all need to be controlled and regulated and so on. So my question is then, would you think of that as agency? And if that is some kind of shared agency, then why do you think something like One Health, which is conceptually such a perfect answer to the theorization of shared agency between human and animal, but even though it's conceptually sound, it's still very, very inadequate. So what's the mismatch there?
I'm not sure. Could you say, what do you mean by, or what is the link for you in this?
Well, if we agree that there is a shared agency between human and animal, then One Health, which looks at health as needing to focus on animal health to improve the overall well-being of everybody, it seems like it's the perfect answer, but
Yes.
it's still very flawed. So I don't know if it's a problem with the formulation of the answer, or if it's just implementation challenges. What do you think? I'm just curious about.
Well, I think any solution, well, a solution to a public health crisis that involves, let's just cull all of the street dogs and eliminate the problem, is not a One Health approach to the issue, because if that were the case, then it wouldn't be quite so easy just to kind of eliminate a huge population because they pose a threat. So I don't know if this is really, I don't know if this is so much an agency problem, or if this is I mean, yes, of course, but who has the agency in this situation? It's not like the dogs are intentionally spreading rabies. I'm not actually sure, is rabies a bacterium or is it a virus? Do you know?
I think it's a virus.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so obviously the rabies virus has that makes sense. It has a lot of agency in this in this scenario, which is then or the coronavirus also obviously has quite a lot of agency, which impacts human and non-human populations, and the only way to, I mean, there is the kind of traditional way of dealing with the problem, which is just you kill everything, or at least everything that isn't being recognized as human. But this is a kind of a biopolitical response. You separate out the infected population and eliminate it. But as regards the limitations of One Health, I mean, I think that it's a question of resources, and it's the zero-sum logic again, right? If we spend all of our resources on helping the dogs, then how are we going to help the humans? And One Health, I guess, is trying to reframe the conversation that actually, it's more beneficial for everybody if you address if you don't treat one category of beings as expendable, and we just need to get rid of them. But I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, that helps.
Okay, good.
Yeah, Susan, I was just thinking about these cases in Kerala and about what I've read about them in the newspapers and social media. I believe that there was also a case of perhaps more of a street dog that was kind of hanged to death, but people, with the noose around his neck, which I found was extremely problematic, but also extremely symbolic and kind of suggestive of crime and punishment. this thing of the dog as an offender. And in fact, even in media reports, since forever, when writing about street dogs, the word menace occurs really all the time. So they are a menace, street dog menace. Recently, they've also been using the word beast and beastly a lot in writing about dogs that have attacked and occasionally sometimes killed children, or were carriers of rabies and ended up infecting people who also died of it. It's really noticeable how the media reports tend to kind of reconstruct the incident, and it's very vivid the way it's done, with interviews of the parents of the children killed or other family members, and the incidents of the dogs being lynched and killed are presented as sort of like justice done by the public, because the state failed them and did not punish the perpetrator. And the dogs are presented as if they were lying in wait for their next victim, as if they were habitual offenders, like the word habitual offender is used to describe a dog that has bitten more than one person. So there I also find that somehow intentionality and even culpability is sort of ascribed to street dogs that are actually in many cases either ill or or scared. But this also obviously has an effect on the people reading the reports in how they end up perceiving street dogs, all street dogs, as being either rabid or potentially rabid or potentially biters. There is a really big problem going on this front in India right now. We are almost out of time now, Kári. This talk was over before I realized it. But before we end for the evening, I really very badly want to request you to tell us a little bit about your zoo project. I'm very curious, and I'm sure the others will be interested to know also.
Sure, I'd be glad to. So this was a research project that was, I got a grant to look at the project is called Reading Zoos in the Age of the Anthropocene, and the grant period is now over, but I'm still working in this area, and the idea was to think about how, or to look at the way that zoos are represented and how they represent themselves in relation to climate change and extinction and so on. And the basic premise is that the zoo as a kind of a cultural, as a cultural institution, exists in order to represent a certain relationship between humans and animals, and and so as that relationship shifts, right? So the function of zoos in the 19th century is or at least in theory, different to their function today. And you can, and my hunch is, or my let's call it a hypothesis, is that at certain moments when the sort of the nature and the status and the position of the human vis-a-vis the natural world, or vis-a-vis its various others, is somehow in crisis or up for debate or whatever, then artists and filmmakers and writers tend to go to the zoo and write about it, or as a way of reflecting on the broader relationship between humanity and its others. And so the project looked mostly at, or I've been looking mostly at texts and films from the last 20 years or so. But the sort of the broader framework is really since the beginning of the 19th century. And I've organized various. My favorite part of the project, apart from or has really been a series of interdisciplinary workshops. The first two of them were in person here, and then the last two were online because of the pandemic, where people from all kinds of different disciplines come in, and we talked about the zoo in all different, from different disciplinary and historical and geographic perspectives. And there's a lot of work going on, and there should be an edited volume coming out at some point in the near future. Well, I don't know. We still need to put it together, but that's on the cards anyway. But I don't know. That was a kind of a general. Do you have? Sorry, go ahead.
That was the thing that I really wanted to ask you also, if we can expect a volume or articles or something that we can read about it.
Yeah, well, I have an article which I'm revising at the moment, which is about which is about the zoo in wartime, which is one of the recurring motifs in representations of zoos since over the last 25 years or so. And I try to think about how these depictions of the wartime destruction of a zoo are kind of metonyms for a growing awareness of the destruction of the natural world outside the cages of the zoo. And so that should be, inshallah, coming out with in a special issue of Textual Practice sometime early next year, I guess. And I have,
Right. Great. Looking
but
forward.
I have a website, or the project has a website, readingzoos.sites.uu.nl, where I will post updates, continue to post updates on the project.
Thank you. That sounds wonderful. Kári, we have one question in the chat. Would you have time to take that up?
Sure. That's a very long question.
Okay, I'll read it out. I would like to question about interspecies empathy and solidarity, setting the discussion in an area of political emotion and affections. Coming back to the subject of suffering, it's a common joke among BLM activists that the public
Black Lives Matter.
care more about people harming dogs than killing Black people. Some animals, we can argue, are framed in a more sympathetic light, as cats and dogs, for instance, than other subaltern human beings, as poor and migrants. At the same time, the public outcry against animal cruelty is also mostly reserved for pet animals, while violence against cattle is completely normalized. Can we actually identify a specificist rationality of animal grievability, to use Butler's term, in our societies? And do you think animal studies can help us to think about intersectionality and violence?
Yes, I think to all of these. I mean, this is definitely true, and is part of the complexity of this issue. That is not simply about. It's not simply about, well, if we pay attention to animals, then that will prevent us from being able to think about slavery or racialized violence and that sort of thing, which is the argument of the hoax article. Because in fact, people do care a lot more about certain types of animals than they do about certain types of humans, and you see this very much in the representation of zoos in wartime, for example, that they tend to be, you get news stories about these conflicts that are happening all over the place. In Syria and Afghanistan and in the West Bank and whatever, and they're representations of these, the lions in cages and whatever that are suffering terribly, and people. So that's so terrible for these poor animals. They're so innocent and whatever, and then but there's no. You don't end up engaging with the conflict itself in any way. So I think, what were the two questions? do I think animal studies can help us think about this intersectionality and violence? I think animal studies has to do this. I think this is if animal studies or one of the sort of urgent tasks of animal studies, I think, would be to address precisely these questions, and how, as I said an hour ago, that the the categories of human and animal are not clear cut, and that in fact these sorts of racialized, sexualized forms of discrimination are all bound up with certain conceptions of the human-animal distinction, that some groups of humans are or we care more about certain groups of animals than we do certain groups of humans. We do. Right, and so it's animal studies has to I think address this, and it is addressing it, or at least I like to think that it is. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kári, for joining us this evening. This has been an absolute pleasure and very, very enriching. Thank you everyone else who's made the time to be here and for your wonderful questions. Have a great evening.
Okay, thank you.